She was 7 months pregnant when she discovered the truth, not through a confession, not through a friend's warning, through a stranger's Instagram post that was never meant for her eyes. Her husband of 8 years was on his knees in a Miami nightclub, proposing to another woman with a ring he had stolen from her dead mother's jewelry box. But here's what makes this story different from every cheating husband story you've ever heard. Rachel Morgan didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't confront him. Instead, she smiled. She kissed him goodnight. And she began planning the most devastating revenge a pregnant wife has ever executed. What happens next will make you question everything you think you know about love, loyalty, and the quiet power of a woman who has been pushed too far. This is the story of how one birthday party destroyed a marriage and how one wife destroyed everything her husband built. Stay until the end. Trust me, you're not ready for what's coming. The fluorescent lights of the emergency room burned white against Rachel Morgan's eyelids. Somewhere beyond the chaos of beeping monitors and rushing footsteps, she heard a voice that didn't sound quite real. "We're losing the baby's heartbeat. Get the crash cart ready. Move, people. Move." Rachel tried to speak, tried to scream, but her body had stopped obeying her commands. The ceiling tiles blurred into abstract shapes as hands pressed against her swollen belly, as needles pierced her arm, as the world she'd fought so hard to build came crashing down around her. 72 hours earlier, everything had been different. 72 hours earlier, Rachel Morgan had been preparing the perfect birthday surprise for her husband of 8 years. The kitchen of their Austin home smelled like Marcus's favorite chocolate ganache cake, the one she'd spent 3 hours perfecting, despite the fact that her swollen feet were screaming for mercy and her lower back felt like someone had driven a knife into it. 7.5 months pregnant, and she was determined to make his 41st birthday special. Rachel caught her reflection in the stainless steel refrigerator and winced. Her honey blonde hair, once her best feature, hung limp around her face. The dark circles under her blue eyes told the story of too many sleepless nights. She'd tried to squeeze into the red dress Marcus loved, but her pregnant belly had other plans. "Your daddy better appreciate this, little one," she murmured to her stomach, feeling the familiar flutter of kicks in response. "Mama looks like a penguin trying to fit into a cocktail dress." Her phone buzzed on the counter. Marcus's face filled the screen, that perfect smile that had made her fall in love with him at a tech conference 9 years ago. "Hey, baby," his voice came through, smooth as aged whiskey. "Listen, I've got some bad news. This conference in Miami is running way longer than expected. I don't think I'll make it home for dinner." Rachel felt her heart sink, but she kept her voice steady. "Marcus, it's your birthday. I made the cake. I bought champagne." I know, and I feel terrible, but this deal could be worth millions, Rach. You understand, right? That's why I married a woman who gets me." In the background, Rachel heard something that made her blood run cold. A woman's laugh, high-pitched and melodic, the kind of laugh that belonged in perfume commercials. "What was that?" she asked. "What was what?" "Oh, that's just the TV. Hotel's got paper-thin walls. Look, I'll make it up to you, okay? I'll be home tomorrow night, and we'll celebrate properly. Love you." The line went dead before Rachel could respond. She stood there in her too small kitchen, surrounded by birthday decorations that suddenly seemed pathetic, holding a phone that felt heavier than it should. Something her therapist had told her years ago echoed through her mind. When your gut screams and your mind makes excuses, trust the gut. The mind is trying to protect you from pain. The gut is trying to protect you from danger. Rachel's gut was screaming, but she pushed it down the way she'd been pushing down her instincts for years. Marcus worked hard. Marcus provided. Marcus loved her, even if his love sometimes felt like an afterthought wedged between business calls and investor meetings. She was being paranoid. Pregnancy hormones. That's all this was. Rachel was about to put away the cake when her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a call. It was an Instagram notification from an account she didn't recognize. "Anonymous 5/2847 has sent you a message." She almost ignored it. Almost. But something made her thumb swipe across the screen, made her click on the message that would destroy everything she thought she knew about her life. The video loaded slowly, pixel by pixel, like a countdown to catastrophe. A Miami nightclub. Expensive. The kind of place with bottle service and velvet ropes. In the center of the frame, surrounded by sparklers and champagne, stood her husband. Marcus was on one knee. He was holding a ring box. And the woman in front of him, the woman gasping with manufactured surprise, the woman wearing a dress that cost more than Rachel's entire maternity wardrobe, was not Rachel. The caption beneath the video was simple. Thought you should know what your husband does at conferences. Check Vanessa Cole's Instagram highlights. The ring might look familiar. Rachel's hands began to shake. Not the gentle tremor of fatigue she'd grown accustomed to, but something deeper. Something that reached into her bones and rattled them loose. Vanessa Cole, 1.8 million followers, lifestyle influencer. Every photo a carefully curated display of perfect abs, designer clothes, and the kind of confidence that came from never having to worry about stretch marks or swollen ankles. Rachel scrolled through the highlights labeled "My Man" with a heart emoji, her throat closing tighter with each image. Marcus at a restaurant Rachel had never been to. Marcus in his Tesla, the one he'd said was just for business meetings. Marcus on a yacht, his arm wrapped around Vanessa's impossibly thin waist. And then Rachel saw it. The ring. Her mother's ring. The antique ruby surrounded by tiny diamonds that had been passed down through 3 generations of her family. The ring she'd cried over 6 months ago when Marcus told her he'd accidentally lost it at the gym. The ring she'd mourned like a death in the family. There it was, gleaming on Vanessa Cole's finger in photo after photo after photo. Rachel didn't scream. She didn't cry. She went completely, utterly still, like an animal that had just realized it was being hunted. This wasn't just an affair. Marcus hadn't just been unfaithful. He had stolen her dead mother's ring and given it to his mistress. He had proposed to another woman while Rachel carried his child. He had looked her in the eyes for 6 months and lied, over and over and over again. The baby kicked hard against Rachel's ribs, as if sensing the earthquake happening in her mother's heart. "I'm so sorry, baby," Rachel whispered into the darkness of her perfect kitchen, surrounded by the decorations for a birthday party that would never happen. "I'm so sorry I didn't see." What would you do if you discovered your husband's betrayal through a stranger's message while carrying his child? Would you confront him immediately, or would you stay silent and plan your next move? Every woman who's ever been deceived knows that first moment of discovery, when the world splits into before and after. Rachel Morgan was about to learn that the discovery was just the beginning. The real nightmare was only getting started. Rachel spent the next 6 hours in a state of suspended animation. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't stop scrolling through Vanessa Cole's Instagram, torturing herself with evidence of a double life she'd been too blind to see. The timestamps told a story that made her physically ill. March 15th, Vanessa at an expensive steakhouse captioned "Dinner with my mystery man." Rachel checked their credit card statement. Marcus had charged $347 at that exact restaurant, claiming he was entertaining a client. April 2nd, Vanessa in workout clothes, thanking her personal trainer. The gym in the background was Titanium Fitness, the same exclusive club where Marcus had suddenly developed an interest in morning workouts. April 20th, Vanessa's manicured hand displaying the ruby ring with the caption, "When he knows exactly what you want." Posted 3 days after Marcus told Rachel they needed to cut back on spending because of the baby coming. The affair had been going on for at least 18 months, maybe longer. Rachel had been pregnant, exhausted, vulnerable, and Marcus had been building an entirely separate life with a woman who was everything Rachel wasn't. Young, thin, free. When Marcus's key turned in the lock at 7 the next morning, Rachel was sitting on the couch exactly where she'd been all night. She hadn't changed out of her maternity clothes. She hadn't bothered to fix her hair. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had just watched her entire world collapse. "Hey, baby." Marcus breezed through the door with the ease of a man who believed his secrets were safe. He was carrying grocery store flowers, the kind of afterthought gesture that confirmed everything Rachel suspected. "I caught an early flight. Wanted to surprise you." He crossed the room and kissed her forehead, his lips leaving a mark that felt like a brand. "You look tired," he observed, settling onto the couch beside her. "Did you sleep at all?" Rachel could have said nothing, could have smiled and pretended and waited for a better moment. But something inside her had broken during those 6 hours of scrolling, and she couldn't hold it in anymore. I know about Vanessa. The words hung in the air between them, heavy and irreversible. Marcus's expression didn't change. If anything, his face went smoother, more controlled, like a mask sliding into place. I'm sorry, what? Vanessa Cole, the influencer, the woman you have been seeing for over a year, the woman you proposed to in Miami with my dead mother's ring. Still no reaction. Marcus tilted his head slightly, the way he did when evaluating a particularly incompetent employee. Rachel, honey, I think you need to take a breath. You're not making any sense. I saw the video, Marcus. Someone sent it to me, you on your knee proposing in a nightclub while I was home making your birthday cake. For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. Then he laughed. Not a guilty laugh, not a nervous laugh, but the condescending chuckle of someone dealing with a child's tantrum. Oh, sweetheart, you got catfished by some internet troll. Do you know how easy it is to make deepfake videos these days? Anyone with basic software can put my face on another person's body. Rachel felt a flicker of doubt. Could it be fake? The technology existed. People made fake videos all the time. The ring, she pressed. My mother's ring. It's on her Instagram. Similar ring. I told you I lost yours. I felt so guilty that I bought a replacement for investment purposes. Must have gotten mixed up somehow. Marcus reached for her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. Baby, I would never do this to you, to us, to our child. His eyes were so sincere, his voice was so steady. For 8 years, Rachel had trusted this man with everything, her heart, her future, her family's heirloom. I saw your text with her, Rachel said weakly, but even as the words left her mouth, she knew she was losing ground. She called you her man. She's a marketing consultant. We use overly friendly language all the time in business. It's just networking. Marcus pulled Rachel into his arms, stroking her hair the way he used to when they were first dating. This is my fault. I've been so busy with work that you've been alone too much, overthinking everything. Pregnancy does that, you know, messes with your hormones. You think I'm crazy. The words came out small, defeated. I think you're stressed and exhausted in carrying our baby, which is the most important job in the world. I think you saw something online and your beautiful, creative brain made up a story that isn't real. He pulled back to look at her face, wiping the tears she didn't realize she'd been crying. I love you, Rachel. Let's not ruin my birthday over an internet hoax, okay? Rachel wanted to believe him. God, she wanted to believe him so badly. Okay, she whispered. I'm sorry, I don't know what I was thinking. Marcus smiled, that perfect smile that had won her over all those years ago. There's my girl. How about I take you to brunch? We can celebrate properly. That night, after Marcus fell asleep with the easy conscience of a man who believed his lies had worked, Rachel lay awake in the darkness. She'd apologized. She'd accepted his explanations. She'd played the role of the paranoid pregnant wife perfectly. But she couldn't sleep. At 2:17 in the morning, Marcus's phone lit up on the nightstand. The screen briefly illuminated the bedroom before going dark again. But Rachel had seen enough. A text from Vanessa. Can't wait for our life to start. Only 2 more months until she pops out the kid and you're free. Rachel didn't reach for the phone. She didn't wake Marcus. She didn't cry or scream or throw things. Instead, she lay perfectly still while something inside her died. And something else woke up. At 3:14 in the morning, Rachel called the only person she trusted absolutely. Carolyn Jenkins answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep but instantly alert. Girl, if you're calling me before sunrise, someone better be dead or about to be. Which one is Marcus? Neither yet. Rachel was surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. Carol, I need you, not as my best friend, as a divorce attorney. The pause on the other end of the line lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then Carol said, I'm on my way. Don't do anything until I get there. And Rach, don't let him know anything's wrong. 20 minutes later, Carol slipped through Rachel's back door, having parked 3 streets over to avoid suspicion. She was wearing pajama pants and a Harvard Law sweatshirt, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun, but her eyes were sharp and calculating. Tell me everything, she said, settling onto Rachel's kitchen floor, because it was the only room without a line of sight from the bedroom. Rachel told her. The video, the ring, the gaslighting, the text message she'd seen on Marcus's phone. When she finished, Carol's expression had transformed from sleepy concern to cold fury. That absolute piece of garbage, Carol whispered. I never liked him, you know. Too smooth, too perfect. Men like that are always hiding something. What do I do, Carol? He made me feel crazy. He almost had me believing I imagined the whole thing. Carol took Rachel's hands in her own. Listen to me carefully, because this is the most important advice I'll ever give you. Never confront without ammunition. Never threaten without follow-through. And never, ever let him know you know until you are ready to destroy him. Right now, your power is his ignorance. Do you understand? Rachel nodded slowly. Good. Now here's what we're going to do. You're going to go back to that bedroom and you're going to be the perfect wife. You're going to smile and make breakfast and pretend everything is fine. And while you're doing that, I'm going to start building your case. By the time Marcus realizes what's happening, you'll have him cornered. Over the next week, Rachel became someone she didn't recognize. She kissed Marcus goodbye every morning and told him she loved him. She listened to his lies about client meetings and late nights at the office. She even apologized again for her crazy pregnancy hormones and promised to see a therapist about her anxiety. Meanwhile, she was methodically dismantling his secrets. The bank accounts came first. Rachel had always let Marcus handle their finances because he was the businessman after all, but she still had access to their joint accounts, and what she found made her sick. Over the past 4 months, Marcus had withdrawn nearly $200,000 in lounge. There were charges at restaurants she'd never been to, hotels in cities she'd never visited, and a jewelry purchase for $2,800 made the day after he told her they couldn't afford the nursery furniture she wanted. Her inheritance fund, the money her parents had left her when they died 3 years ago, had been nearly drained. $300,000 reduced to less than $40,000. Rachel screenshot everything. The emails came next. Marcus's laptop password was embarrassingly easy to guess. Ranger 1980, his childhood dog's name and birth year. What she found in his inbox made the affair seem almost trivial by comparison. Marcus had been embezzling from his own company. He'd been using Rachel's inheritance to cover losses and pay off investors who'd started asking uncomfortable questions. The entire Morgan Tech empire was built on quicksand, and Marcus had been desperately shoveling money to keep it from collapsing. But the most devastating discovery came buried in a folder labeled Tax Documents 2019. Emails between Marcus and his mother, Diane Hartley. Subject line, the Vanessa situation. Diane had written, I've arranged the apartment as we discussed. 12 months paid in advance. Anything to get that woman out of my son's life so he can focus on giving me a proper grandchild. Vanessa understands this is temporary, correct? Marcus had replied, she knows the plan. Once Rachel has the baby and settles into the mom routine, I'll file for divorce. Vanessa's been very patient. Thanks for the apartment, Mom. I knew I could count on you. Rachel stared at the screen for a long time. It wasn't just Marcus betraying her. It was Diane, too. The mother-in-law who had never thought Rachel was good enough. The woman who smiled at family dinners while secretly funding her son's affair. The grandmother of Rachel's unborn child. They had been planning this for years. Rachel was never supposed to keep Marcus. She was supposed to be a placeholder, a womb, a stepping stone to the life he actually wanted. The realization should have destroyed her. Instead, it made her absolutely certain of what she needed to do. She forwarded every email to her private account, then carefully closed everything and returned Marcus's laptop to its exact position. When Marcus came home that evening, he found Rachel in the nursery, folding tiny baby clothes and humming softly. You seem happy, he observed, leaning against the doorframe. I am, Rachel said, and meant it. I had a very productive day. Made some important plans for the future. That's great, baby. Planning ahead is smart. Rachel continued folding, her movements calm and methodical. Actually, speaking of plans, I've been thinking about when you go on your Seattle trip next month. I might ask my sister to come stay with me. I don't want to be alone this close to my due date. That sounds perfect, Marcus said, already checking his phone. I'll feel better knowing someone's with you. He had no idea that Rachel didn't have a sister. She did, however, have Carolyn Jenkins, a signed lease on a small apartment across town, A newly opened bank account with what remained of her money, and a folder full of evidence that would burn Marcus Morgan's carefully constructed life to the ground. Daddy thinks he's so clever, Rachel whispered to her belly that night, while Marcus snored peacefully beside her, but he's about to learn that Mommy is smarter than he ever imagined. The morning Rachel chose to destroy her marriage dawned bright and beautiful, the kind of Texas spring day that made everything seem possible. She woke before Marcus, made his coffee exactly the way he liked it, and kissed him goodbye with more tenderness than she'd shown him in weeks. "Have a great day," she said, watching him back out of the driveway. "I love you." The words tasted like ash in her mouth. The moment his Tesla disappeared around the corner, Rachel sprang into action. She'd been planning this for 2 weeks, choreographing every detail with Caro's help. Nothing could be left to chance. The moving company arrived at exactly 9. Two men with a small truck hired for what Rachel had described as relocating some personal items to a friend's house while my husband travels. They worked efficiently, loading boxes she'd secretly packed over the past week. Her clothes, important documents, her laptop, the few pieces of furniture that were genuinely hers. Everything else stayed exactly where it was. By noon, the house looked almost identical to how it had that morning, minus Rachel's presence. She'd left no note, no explanation, no angry letter, just silence. Her final stop before leaving Scottsdale was Marcus's office building. She didn't go inside. She wasn't ready for that confrontation yet. Instead, she sat in the parking garage for 20 minutes, watching his employees come and go from the tech company he'd built on her stolen money. Then she drove to downtown Austin, to the high-rise building where Morgan Tech occupied 3 floors, and walked through the front door like she owned the place. Because legally, she did own half of it. The receptionist recognized her immediately. "Mrs. Morgan, what a lovely surprise. Mr. Morgan is in a meeting, but I can let him know you're here." "That won't be necessary." Rachel smiled sweetly. "I just need to deliver something. It's a surprise for his birthday. Can you tell me which conference room he's in?" 3 minutes later, Rachel pushed open the door to conference room A, where Marcus sat at the head of a table surrounded by his development team. Every head turned toward her. Every mouth fell silent. Marcus's face cycled through confusion, then forced warmth, then something approaching fear when he saw what Rachel was carrying. "Baby," he said carefully, rising from his chair. "What are you doing here? Is everything okay with the pregnancy?" "Everything's fine," Rachel said, her voice carrying clearly through the room. "I just wanted to deliver your birthday present personally. Better late than never, right?" She placed the manila envelope on the conference table in front of him. "Happy belated birthday, Marcus. I got you something special." She leaned in close enough to whisper the next words. "Your freedom. Enjoy it." Then she turned and walked out, leaving Marcus to open the envelope in front of 15 employees who were suddenly very interested in their phones. Inside were divorce papers, full petition, grounds of adultery and financial misconduct, requests for emergency custody of their unborn child. Rachel made it to the elevator before her knees started shaking. Made it to her car before the tears started falling. Made it to her new apartment, a tiny one-bedroom above a coffee shop, before she allowed herself to collapse onto the bare mattress and sob. She'd done it after 8 years of marriage, after months of lies and gaslighting and systematic theft. She'd finally fought back. Caro called that evening, her voice triumphant. "I heard he was white as a ghost when he opened those papers. Apparently he had to cancel the rest of his meetings. Everyone's talking about it." "Is it over?" Rachel asked, exhaustion seeping into every syllable. "Is it finally over?" "The hardest part is," Caro assured her, "now we just wait for his lawyers to contact us. Given the evidence we have, he'll probably try to settle quickly to avoid a scandal." Rachel allowed herself to believe it. She'd served the papers publicly, humiliating him in front of his employees. She had documentation of his affair, his financial crimes, his mother's involvement. She had leverage, and she'd used it. For the first time in months, Rachel fell asleep feeling something like peace. 24 hours later, her world collapsed all over again. It started with a phone call from her new landlord. "Mrs. Morgan, I'm terribly sorry, but we need to cancel your lease. Someone called our office with concerning information about your mental health history. Given the liability issues, we simply can't move forward. We'll return your deposit in full, of course. Rachel's blood went cold. Who called you? What information? I'm afraid I can't share that, but I'd recommend seeking help, Mrs. Morgan, for yourself and your baby. Before Rachel could respond, her phone buzzed with a notification from her bank. The new private account she'd opened, the one containing the remnants of her independence, had been frozen pending investigation into potential fraud. Then came the Instagram notification. Vanessa Cole had posted a story. The caption read, "Sending love to the Morgan family during this difficult time. Mental illness is serious. Praying for the baby's safety. Mental health awareness, hashtag." The post had already been shared hundreds of times. The comments were brutal. Poor Marcus, dealing with a crazy pregnant wife. No wonder he needed someone stable like Vanessa. Hope they get that baby away from her before she hurts it. Rachel called Caro with trembling fingers. What's happening? How is this happening? Caro's voice was grim. He was ready for you, Rach. He's been planning a counterattack for months, probably since before you even found out about the affair. What do you mean he was ready? I mean, he's already filed a motion claiming you're mentally unstable and financially irresponsible. He's got affidavits from colleagues saying you've been erratic. He's claiming you stole marital assets when you opened that bank account. Caro paused. And Rachel, his mother, signed a statement supporting all of it. Rachel drove to her marital home in a daze, hoping somehow that she could salvage something from the wreckage. Maybe she could get more clothes. Maybe she could find evidence she'd missed. But when she pulled into the driveway, she found her belongings piled on the lawn in black garbage bags. The locks had been changed. A notice was taped to the front door. Court order. Resident deemed potential threat. Temporary custody hearing scheduled for Monday. Rachel sank to her knees on the grass, 7.5 months pregnant, surrounded by the trash-bagged remnants of her life. The neighbors were watching from their windows. Some of them were filming. A car pulled up to the curb, a silver Mercedes that Rachel recognized immediately. Diane Hartley rolled down her window, her perfectly coiffed hair catching the afternoon light. She looked at her daughter-in-law, kneeling on the lawn like garbage, and she smiled. I told Marcus you were trash when he married you, Diane said sweetly. Should have listened to his mother. Don't worry, I'll make sure my grandchild is raised properly. By a real mother. The window rolled up. The Mercedes drove away. And Rachel Morgan, who had thought she was the one in control, realized she hadn't even begun to understand what she was fighting against. Caro arrived within the hour, bundling Rachel into her car and driving her to safety while the neighbors continued to film from their windows. You're staying with me, Caro said, her voice leaving no room for argument. We'll figure this out. We'll fix this. But right now, you need to be somewhere safe. Rachel nodded numbly, her hand pressed against her belly where the baby had gone ominously still, as if sensing the chaos surrounding them. That night, the first catastrophe struck. Rachel was lying on Caro's guest bed, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything that had happened, when a sharp pain ripped through her abdomen. She gasped, doubling over, and felt something warm spreading beneath her. Caro, she screamed, something's wrong. The ambulance ride was a blur of sirens and strangers' faces and medical jargon that Rachel couldn't process. Words like preeclampsia and stress, induced and fetal distress floated past her consciousness like debris in a flood. At the hospital, a doctor with kind eyes and a grave expression explained the situation. Your blood pressure is dangerously elevated, Mrs. Morgan. The stress you have been under has put significant strain on your body and your baby. If we can't stabilize you, we may need to perform an emergency delivery. But I'm only 7.5 months along, Rachel whispered. I know. We're going to do everything we can to keep that baby safe. But I need you to try to stay calm. Can you do that for me? Staying calm felt like asking her to sprout wings and fly. Her husband had destroyed her. His mother was trying to take her child. The internet thought she was crazy. And now her own body was failing her. But somewhere beneath the terror, Rachel found a thread of steel she didn't know she possessed. I can do that, she said. The second catastrophe arrived the next morning, while Rachel was still hooked to monitors and IV drips and the beeping machinery that tracked her baby's heartbeat. A process server walked into her hospital room. Rachel Morgan? Yes? You've been served. The papers he handed her were a nightmare in legal formatting. Marcus wasn't just countering her divorce petition. He was suing for primary custody of their unborn child. His motion claimed Rachel was mentally unstable, financially irresponsible, and potentially dangerous to herself and others. It referenced her erratic behavior during the pregnancy. It cited witnesses, employees, and acquaintances who had noticed her seeming disconnected from reality. The final page contained an affidavit from Diane Hartley, swearing under oath that she had personally witnessed Rachel threatening to harm herself and her baby if Marcus didn't give her more money. Rachel's hands shook so badly she could barely hold the papers. "This is lies," she said to no one. "This is all lies." But in the world of family court, it didn't matter what was true. It mattered what could be proven. The third catastrophe came later that evening while Rachel was borrowing a nurse's phone to check her email because her own had died and she hadn't thought to bring a charger in the ambulance. A Google alert she'd set up months ago dinged with a new hit. Vanessa Cole had posted again. The image showed Vanessa wearing a white dress, twirling in front of a mirror with a caption that made Rachel's vision blur. "Vintage shopping find. When you know, you know." Ring emoji. It was Rachel's wedding dress. The dress her mother had helped her pick out 6 years ago, before the cancer took her. The dress Rachel had stored in their guest closet, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, hoping someday to pass it down to a daughter of her own. Marcus had given it to his mistress, just like he'd given her the ring, just like he was trying to give her their child. Rachel lay in that hospital bed, monitors beeping their mechanical rhythm, and felt something inside her finally break. Maybe they're right, she thought. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe I don't deserve this baby. Maybe Marcus will be a better parent without me destroying everything. Maybe everyone would be better off if I just stopped fighting. She reached for the phone to call Marcus, to surrender, to give up, to end this war she was so clearly losing. And then her baby kicked. Hard. Harder than she'd ever kicked before. Again and again and again, like tiny fists beating against the walls of a prison. Rachel looked down at her belly at this child who was fighting to exist, even when her mother had nearly given up, and she heard her own mother's voice in her memory. "Rachel, baby, you were never meant to be small. You were meant to take up space. The world will try to shrink you. Don't let it." Rachel put down the phone. She didn't know how she was going to win this fight. She didn't know if winning was even possible anymore. But she knew with sudden crystal clarity that she was done being a victim. Rock bottom isn't where you die. It's where you finally stop digging your own grave and start building your ladder out. Rachel pressed the call button for her nurse. "I need to make some phone calls," she said when the woman appeared. "And I need my phone charged. And I need to talk to my lawyer." The nurse looked at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "There's a phone charger at the nurse's station. And honey, whatever you're going through, you look like someone who's about to turn things around." Rachel managed a small smile. She had no money, no home, no evidence that hadn't been discredited, and she had approximately 48 hours before a custody hearing that could take her child away forever. But she also had something Marcus Morgan had never anticipated. She had absolutely nothing left to lose. The text message arrived at 6 in the morning from a number Rachel didn't recognize. "This is Tommy Crawford. We need to talk. About Marcus. I have information that could help you. Can we meet?" Rachel stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Tommy Crawford had been Marcus's business partner for 5 years. They'd built Morgan Tech together. At least that was the story Marcus told. If anyone knew where the bodies were buried, it was Tommy. But why would he help her? She texted back, "Why should I trust you?" His response came immediately. "Because Vanessa was my girlfriend first. 3 years before Marcus stole her. I want him destroyed as much as you do." They met in the hospital cafeteria 2 hours later, Tommy sliding into the seat across from Rachel with a coffee he didn't drink and a folder he kept clutched to his chest. He was handsome in a rumpled sort of way, the kind of man who forgot to comb his hair because he was too busy thinking about more important things. His eyes were tired but kind, and when he looked at Rachel's pregnant belly, she saw something like sympathy in his expression. "I'm sorry for what you're going through," he said. "I know that doesn't help, but I wanted you to know." Tell me what you have, Rachel said. She didn't have time for pleasantries. Tommy opened the folder and began spreading documents across the table. Marcus has been embezzling from our company for 3 years. He's been using your inheritance to cover losses and pay off investors who were starting to ask questions. But it goes deeper than that. He pointed to a highlighted section. He's been cooking the books to hide the fact that Morgan Tech is hemorrhaging money. Without your inheritance propping it up, the company would have collapsed 18 months ago. Rachel felt dizzy. Why didn't you report him? Because until last week, I didn't have enough evidence to prove it wasn't the both of us. Marcus is smart. He set it up so that if anyone investigated, I'd go down with him. Tommy's jaw tightened, but then he got sloppy, started making mistakes because he was distracted by Vanessa, by the divorce, by trying to take you down. I've been documenting everything. Why help me? What do you get out of this? Tommy's expression hardened. Vanessa and I were together for 3 years. I was going to propose. Then Marcus decided he wanted her. And suddenly I was the boring business partner and he was the exciting CEO with the company credit card. He paused. She knew I was planning to propose. She knew and she still chose him. So yeah, I want him destroyed. But I also genuinely don't want him raising a child. The man is a monster wearing a charming smile. Rachel looked at the documents spread before her. Financial records, email chains, internal communications that painted a picture of systematic fraud. This is incredible, she breathed. But I already had evidence. Marcus's lawyers got it thrown out. They got your evidence thrown out because you obtained it without proper documentation of chain of custody. Tommy slid another folder across the table. I'm a partner in the company. I have legitimate access to all of this. They can't discredit testimony from the inside. For the first time in days, Rachel felt something like hope flicker in her chest. That evening, Carol arrived at the hospital with her own revelations. I've been digging into Diane Hartley's finances, Carol said, spreading her own papers across Rachel's hospital bed. And guess what? The Wealthy Widow Act is exactly that. An act. Diane's been hemorrhaging money for years on bad investments and expensive tastes. She's been living off Marcus for the past decade, But she paid for Vanessa's apartment, Rachel protested. I saw the emails. She paid for it with money Marcus gave her, which means she paid for it with money Marcus stole from you. Carol's smile was predatory. The whole family is a house of cards, Rach. Diane needs Marcus to stay successful and married to money because without that, she's broke. That's why she's fighting so hard to help him win custody. If you take Marcus down, her entire lifestyle collapses with him. The final revelation came from an unexpected source. Rachel had been trying to trace the anonymous Instagram account that had first sent her the video of Marcus proposing. She'd assumed it was a stranger, someone in the club that night who recognized Marcus and decided to do the right thing. But the digital breadcrumbs led somewhere much more interesting. The account belonged to Brittany Wells. Brittany had been Vanessa's assistant for 2 years before being fired in the most public and humiliating way possible. Vanessa had accused her of stealing, called her incompetent on social media, and essentially blacklisted her from the influencer industry. Rachel found Brittany's real Instagram and sent her a message. I know you sent me the video, thank you. Can we talk? Brittany's response arrived within minutes. I've been waiting for someone to use that information. I have more. So much more. Vanessa thought she could destroy my life without consequences. She was wrong. The 3 women met in Rachel's hospital room that night, an unlikely alliance of the wronged and the angry and the determined. Brittany brought a hard drive containing 2 years of Vanessa's unfiltered communication. Text messages where she called Rachel a cow and a breeding machine. Emails discussing how to spin the narrative once Marcus finally left. Voice notes where she laughed about wearing Rachel's mother's ring. She made me back up everything to the cloud, Brittany explained, in case she lost her phone. Guess she forgot about that when she fired me. Tommy brought certified copies of the financial documents, complete with his sworn statement as a witness to Marcus's fraud. Carol brought legal strategy and the fierce determination of a woman who took betrayal personally. And Rachel, lying in her hospital bed with monitors tracking her baby's heartbeat, brought the one thing none of them could manufacture. The moral high ground of a pregnant woman who had been systematically destroyed by the people who were supposed to love her. "We have enough," Caro said when they'd laid everything out. "We have enough to bury him." Rachel looked at the evidence spread across her blanket: financial fraud, emotional manipulation, coordinated attacks on her mental health, a pattern of behavior that painted Marcus Morgan as exactly what he was, a predator who had chosen Rachel as his victim. "What happens now?" she asked. Caro's smile was sharp as a blade. "Now we give them a chance to surrender. And when they refuse, we destroy them." The settlement meeting took place in Marcus's lawyer's conference room, a sleek space on the 32nd floor of a downtown Austin high-rise. Rachel arrived flanked by Caro, Tommy, and the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing you held all the cards. Marcus was already there, sitting at the head of the table like he owned it. His lawyer, a silver-haired shark named Richard Thornton, sat beside him with the smug expression of someone who expected an easy victory. "Mrs. Morgan," Thornton began, "we appreciate you agreeing to meet. My client is prepared to offer a generous settlement in exchange for dropping all allegations and agreeing to shared custody." "We're not here to accept offers," Caro said coolly. "We're here to make one." She opened her briefcase and began placing documents on the table. Financial records showing Marcus's embezzlement, email chains proving Diane's involvement in the affair, screenshots of Vanessa's communications describing their plan to take Rachel's child, and finally a sworn statement from Tommy Crawford detailing 3 years of fraud at Morgan Tech. Marcus's face went from confident to confused to white as paper. "Here's what's going to happen," Rachel said, speaking for the first time. Her voice was steady, calm, almost gentle. "You're going to drop the custody suit. You're going to admit to adultery in our divorce proceedings. I'm going to get the house, full custody of our child, and 60% of all remaining marital assets." Thornton scoffed. "Mrs. Morgan, these documents are clearly fabricated. We'll have them thrown out just like the last batch. These documents were obtained and verified by your client's own business partner." Caro nodded toward Tommy. "Mr. Crawford is prepared to testify to their authenticity. He's also prepared to share them with the FBI, your investors, and every news outlet in Texas if necessary." Marcus finally found his voice. "Tommy, what the hell are you doing?" "What you should have done years ago," Tommy replied evenly. "The right thing." The room fell silent. Rachel watched her husband's face, searching for some sign of the man she'd loved, the man she'd trusted, the man she'd built a life with. But all she saw was calculation, the gears turning as Marcus tried to find a way out. "Fine," Marcus said at IBLS. "You want the divorce? You can have it. You want custody? Fine, just keep this quiet. A scandal would destroy the company, and then nobody gets anything." Rachel felt a wave of relief wash over her. It was over. After everything, it was finally over. "We'll have the revised settlement papers drawn up by end of business tomorrow," Caro said. "I expect your signatures within 72 hours." Rachel walked out of that conference room with her head high, her hand on her belly, and tears streaming down her face. She'd won. She'd actually won. "You did it," Tommy said softly, walking beside her to the elevator. "You beat him. I couldn't have done it without you. Any of you." Caro was already on her phone, making arrangements for the next steps. "We should celebrate. I know a great restaurant that serves mocktails for pregnant people." Rachel laughed, really laughed, for the first time in weeks. "That sounds perfect." Oh, they never made it to the restaurant. 45 minutes later, Rachel was on Caro's couch with her feet up when her phone buzzed with a news alert. Breaking: local tech CEO Marcus Morgan held a press conference today claiming his estranged wife attempted to blackmail him with fabricated evidence. He is filing criminal charges and offering a $50,000 reward for information about what he called a conspiracy against his family and his company. The screen showed Marcus at a podium, his face appropriately grave and wounded. Beside him, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue, stood Vanessa Cole. "We just want peace," Vanessa said into the microphones. "Rachel is clearly unwell. She needs help, not condemnation. We're praying for the baby's safety." Rachel's phone began exploding with notifications: hate messages, death threats, strangers calling her a psycho wife, a blackmailer, a danger to her own child. Carol called Marcus's lawyer's office and got the news that made everything worse. His team filed an emergency motion claiming all our evidence was obtained through illegal means. The judge threw it out pending a full investigation. Carol's voice was hollow. Rachel, we're back to zero, and the custody hearing is in 48 hours. Rachel sat in the growing darkness of Carol's living room, watching the news coverage paint her as a villain, watching strangers decide she was crazy based on a 30-second press conference. Marcus had outmaneuvered her again. He'd accepted her terms in private, then gone public with the claims of blackmail before she could release anything herself. He'd flipped the narrative, made himself the victim, turned his own fraud investigation into proof of his wife's instability. And now, in 48 hours, a judge would decide whether Rachel got to keep her baby. "What do we do?" she whispered. Carol sat down beside her, taking her hand. "We can't beat him with evidence he can discredit. He's too good at controlling the story." "Then how do we beat him?" Tommy spoke from the doorway, his expression thoughtful. "We don't beat him, we make him beat himself." Rachel looked up. "What do you mean?" "Marcus is a narcissist. He can't resist an audience. If we give him a stage, he'll hang himself with his own words." Tommy moved into the room, his eyes bright with the light of an idea. "There's a charity event this Saturday night. Big donors, important people, lots of press coverage. Marcus is sponsoring it. He'll be there playing the wounded husband." Carol caught on immediately. "If Rachel shows up in public looking calm and sympathetic and very pregnant, Marcus won't be able to help himself," Tommy finished. "He'll try to control the narrative. And when he does, we'll be ready." Rachel looked between them. These two people who had no reason to help her except their own wounds and their sense of justice. "It's risky," she said. "If it doesn't work, I could lose everything." "You could lose everything anyway," Carol pointed out gently. "At least this way, you're not going down without a fight." Rachel placed her hand on her belly, where her baby was kicking steadily, rhythmically, like a drumbeat calling her to war. "Okay," she said, "let's end this." The Austin Children's Hospital Charity Gala was the social event of the spring season. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow light across a ballroom filled with Texas oil money and tech wealth. The guest list read like a who's who of Austin society, and the press coverage would be extensive. Rachel arrived at precisely 8:15, wearing a navy blue maternity dress that made her look elegant and fragile and unmistakably pregnant. Carol walked beside her in a red power suit. Tommy lingered near the entrance, ready to step in if needed. They'd spent the past 48 hours preparing for every possible scenario. Carol had coached Rachel on staying calm, on speaking clearly, on not letting Marcus provoke her into anything that could be used against her. Tommy had reached out to a few key investors who he knew were already suspicious about Morgan Tech's finances. Brittany had quietly shared some of Vanessa's more damaging messages with a gossip blogger who was always hungry for influencer drama. The groundwork was laid. Now Rachel just needed to perform. She moved through the crowd with grace, accepting condolences from acquaintances who didn't know what to believe about her marriage, smiling politely at people who had probably called her crazy behind her back. Marcus saw her before she saw him. His face went through a rapid sequence of emotions: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally a practiced mask of concerned sympathy. He approached with Vanessa on his arm, both of them dressed impeccably, both of them radiating the confidence of people who believed they had already won. "Rachel," Marcus said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Honey, you shouldn't be here. Let me take you home. You need rest." Rachel smiled serenely. "Like you took me home from our wedding, Marcus? In the dress you gave to your mistress?" Murmurs rippled through the crowd. People were turning to watch. Some were already filming on their phones. Marcus's expression flickered, but he recovered quickly. "Sweetheart, this isn't the time or place. You're not well. Everyone can see that." Vanessa stepped forward, her voice dripping with false concern. "This is really sad. Rachel, we're worried about you. The stress isn't good for the baby." Rachel turned to face Vanessa directly, maintaining her calm. "Vanessa, I have a question for you. That ring you're wearing, the one Marcus bought as an investment, do you know what year it was made?" Vanessa glanced at the ruby ring on her finger, clearly confused by the question. 1962? Vintage? Marcus has incredible taste. 1962, the same year my mother was born." Rachel's voice carried clearly through the now silent ballroom. Because that ring was hers. It was her engagement ring, passed down through my family for 3 generations. Marcus told me he lost it 6 months ago, at the gym. The murmurs grew louder. People were openly staring now. Marcus tried to interrupt. Rachel, this is insane. You're embarrassing yourself. What I find insane, Marcus, is that you stole my dead mother's ring to give to the woman you've been cheating on me with for over a year. What I find insane is that you drained my inheritance to fund your affair while telling me we couldn't afford nursery furniture. What I find insane is that you and your mother have been planning to take my baby since before she was even conceived. Marcus's composure cracked. His face flushed red, his jaw tightened, and Rachel saw the real man beneath the charming mask. The man who'd gaslit her for months. The man who'd called her crazy to cover his own sins. You don't know what you're talking about, he hissed. You're delusional. Everyone here can see you're having some kind of breakdown. Then explain the emails, Rachel said calmly. The ones between you and your mother discussing how to handle the Vanessa situation. The ones where you outlined your plan to wait until I, quote, settled into the mom routine before filing for divorce. Marcus's face went pale. You went through my private communications? You used my inheritance to pay for your girlfriend's apartment. I'd say that makes your communications very much my business. From across the ballroom, Diane Hartley came rushing toward them, her face twisted with fury. Marcus, stop. Not here. There are investors watching. But Marcus was beyond reason now. The careful control he'd maintained for years was crumbling, and everyone was watching it happen. Shut up, mother, he snapped. This is your fault. If you'd kept paying for Vanessa's apartment like I told you, none of this would have happened. Dead silence fell over the ballroom. Diane's face went white. Several of the investors she'd been trying to impress were staring at her with dawning understanding. Marcus, Vanessa said, her voice small and uncertain. What is she talking about? You said the ring was clean. You said Rachel knew about us. You said you were separated. I told you what you needed to hear, Marcus snarled, pounding on her. That's what you wanted, right? The fantasy? Don't act like you didn't know exactly what you were signing up for. Vanessa took a step back, her face crumbling. In that moment, Rachel almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Marcus turned back to Rachel, his composure completely shattered. You think you've won? You think any of this matters? I will bury you. I will take everything you have. I will make sure you never see our child again. He grabbed Rachel's arm, his fingers digging in hard. The gasp from the crowd was audible. Phones were pointed at them from every direction, recording everything. Let go of me, Rachel said quietly. Marcus's grip only tightened. Mr. Morgan, a voice called from nearby, I strongly suggest you release your wife immediately. It was one of the investors, a silver-haired man with steel in his eyes. Behind him stood Tommy Crawford, and behind Tommy stood 2 security guards who had been quietly alerted to the situation. Marcus looked around the ballroom at the dozens of witnesses, the recording phones, the disgusted expressions on faces that had smiled at him hours before. He looked at his mother, frozen in horror. He looked at Vanessa, backing away from him with tears streaming down her face. And finally, he looked at Rachel, his pregnant wife, the woman he'd betrayed and gaslit and tried to destroy. The woman who was standing before him now, with bruises already forming on her arm, calm and dignified and utterly victorious. This isn't over, he said. But they both knew it was. The video spread across the internet like wildfire in a drought. Within the first hour, it had been shared over 10,000 times. By midnight, that number had climbed to 100,000. By morning, Rachel Morgan's face was on every entertainment news site in America, and the name Marcus Morgan had become synonymous with everything people despised about wealthy, entitled men who believed their money made them untouchable. Rachel watched it all unfold from her hospital bed, where she'd been admitted for observation after her blood pressure spiked to dangerous levels following the confrontation at the gala. The stress of the evening, combined with the physical strain of standing for hours and the emotional toll of finally facing her tormentor, had pushed her body to its limits. Your blood pressure is stabilizing, Dr. Martinez told her during morning rounds, but I want to keep you here for at least another 48 hours. The preeclampsia is still a concern, and with everything you have been through, your body needs rest. I don't know if I remember how to rest, Rachel admitted. Dr. Martinez smiled gently. Learn, for your daughter's sake, if not your own. Caro arrived at 9 with coffee she couldn't drink and news she desperately wanted to hear. It's happening, Caro said, settling into the chair beside Rachel's bed and pulling out her tablet. Everything we hoped for and more. Let me show you. She turned the screen so Rachel could see the headline from the Austin American-Statesman. Morgan Tech CEO caught on camera assaulting pregnant wife at charity gala. Assault is a strong word, Rachel murmured. He grabbed you hard enough to leave bruises in front of 100 witnesses while you were visibly pregnant. That's assault. Caro swiped to the next article. But wait, it gets better. The second headline was from a financial news site. Morgan Tech investors demand emergency board meeting following CEO scandal. Tommy reached out this morning, Caro continued. He says at least 4 major investors have already indicated they're pulling their funding. The company's stock has dropped 30% since the video went viral. Rachel felt a complicated mix of emotions swirling through her chest. Satisfaction, certainly. Vindication, but also a strange sadness for the life she'd thought she was building, now revealed to have been nothing but smoke and mirrors. What about the FBI investigation? She asked. That's the best part. Caro's smile turned predatory. Tommy submitted his evidence directly to the federal prosecutor's office this morning. Combined with the public nature of Marcus's meltdown, they fast-tracked the investigation. An agent called me an hour ago to schedule an interview with you. Me? Why me? Because you're the victim of financial fraud, Rach. Marcus used your inheritance to cover his embezzlement. That makes you a material witness. Caro squeezed her hand. This isn't just about the divorce anymore. This is criminal prosecution. Federal charges, real consequences. Rachel leaned back against her pillows, processing the magnitude of what was happening. For months, she'd felt powerless against Marcus's money and connections, an ability to manipulate every situation to his advantage. Now, finally, the walls were closing in on him. What about Vanessa? She asked. Caro's expression flickered with something that might have been sympathy. Her Instagram following dropped by 200,000 overnight. 3 of her biggest sponsors have already terminated their contracts. Someone leaked those text messages where she called you a cow and a breeding machine, and the comments on her posts are absolutely savage. Good, Rachel said, then immediately felt guilty for the satisfaction in her voice. Is that terrible that I'm glad she's suffering? After everything she did to you? After she knowingly participated in destroying your marriage and trying to take your child? Caro shook her head firmly. You're entitled to some satisfaction, Rach. That doesn't make you a bad person. It makes you human. A knock on the door interrupted them. Tommy Crawford stood in the doorway, looking exhausted but triumphant, holding a bouquet of sunflowers. I hope I'm not intruding, he said. I just wanted to see how you were doing, and to give you these. He held up the flowers with an awkward smile. The gift shop didn't have much selection, but sunflowers seemed right. They turned toward the light, seemed appropriate. Rachel felt tears prick her eyes at the unexpected kindness. They're beautiful, thank you. Tommy settled into the chair on the opposite side of her bed from Caro, and for a moment Rachel marveled at how her support system had grown. A year ago she'd been isolated and alone, cut off from friends and family by Marcus's subtle manipulation. Now she had people fighting for her, believing in her, showing up when she needed them. I need to tell you something, Tommy said, his expression turning serious. I got a call from Richard Thornton this morning. Marcus's lawyer. Rachel's stomach tightened. And? Marcus wants to settle. Everything. The divorce, the custody arrangement, all of it. Thornton says his client recognizes that continued litigation would be detrimental to everyone involved. Tommy's voice dripped with sarcasm on the last phrase. Translation: Marcus knows he's going to prison and wants to wrap up the civil matters before the criminal ones destroy him completely. Caro sat up straight. What kind of settlement terms? Full custody to Rachel, supervised visitation only. The house, 65% of liquid assets. Tommy paused. And a formal admission of adultery for the divorce record. Rachel stared at him. That's more than we asked for. That's what happens when you have all the leverage, Caro said, her voice triumphant. He's desperate, Rach. He knows that every day this drags on, his reputation crumbles further. The settlement is his way of trying to control at least some of the narrative. Should I take it? Caro and Tommy exchanged glances. That's your decision, Caro said carefully. But if you're asking for my professional opinion, yes, take it. A trial would be emotionally exhausting, especially with a newborn. And there's always risk in court, even when you think you have a solid case. This way, you get everything you want without the uncertainty. What about justice? Rachel asked. What about making him face what he did in a courtroom? Tommy leaned forward. He's going to face it in a courtroom, Rachel, just not a family court. The federal prosecutors are building a case that could put him away for 15 years. That's real justice, more real than any divorce settlement could provide. Rachel thought about it for a long moment. The part of her that had been gaslit and manipulated and made to feel crazy for months wanted to drag Marcus through every possible legal proceeding, wanted to watch him squirm under cross-examination, wanted to hear a judge declare publicly that she had been wronged. But the part of her that was growing a new human being inside her body, the part that had learned the hard way that survival sometimes meant choosing battles wisely, that part understood what Caro and Tommy were saying. Okay, she said finally, tell Thornton we accept, but I want one more thing added to the terms. What's that? Caro asked. I want a written acknowledgement signed by Marcus that he engaged in a systematic campaign of psychological manipulation and gaslighting throughout our marriage. I want him to admit, on paper, that he tried to make me believe I was mentally unstable to cover his own infidelity. Rachel's voice was steady despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. I don't need it for the court. I need it for me, so that when I'm old and gray and my memory starts to fade, I'll have proof that what happened to me was real, that I wasn't crazy, that I was right all along. Caro nodded slowly, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I'll make sure it's in the final agreement. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of legal documents, in medical appointments, in the strange limbo of waiting for her life to start over. Marcus signed the settlement agreement on a Tuesday in his lawyer's office without ever looking Rachel in the eye. She watched him through the glass conference room door. This man she'd loved for 8 years, now reduced to a shell of the confident executive she'd married. His suit hung loose on his frame. His hair had gone gray at the temples. His hands trembled slightly as he signed document after document. For a moment, Rachel felt something that might have been pity. Then she remembered the text message from Vanessa. Only 2 more months until she pops out the kid and you're free. She remembered the emails planning her dismissal from his life. She remembered standing on her own lawn surrounded by garbage bags full of her possessions while Diane Hartley called her trash. The pity evaporated. The custody hearing, which had once loomed over Rachel like a death sentence, became a simple formality. Judge Catherine Reyes reviewed the settlement agreement, asked Rachel a few questions about her living situation and support system, and signed off on the arrangement without hesitation. Mrs. Morgan, Judge Reyes said as she handed Rachel the final custody order, I've been doing this job for 23 years. I've seen a lot of cases. Most of them are messy and complicated, with fault on both sides. She paused, her expression softening. This is not one of those cases. You were wronged by someone who should have protected you, and you fought back with courage and integrity. Your daughter is lucky to have you as her mother. Rachel's throat tightened. Thank you, Your Honor. Outside the courtroom, Caro whooped so loudly that several people in the hallway turned to stare. We did it. We actually did it. You did it, Rachel corrected, pulling her friend into an awkward hug made difficult by her enormous belly. I couldn't have survived any of this without you. Please. You're the one who stood up in front of 100 people and called out your cheating husband while looking like a goddess of righteous fury. Caro grinned. I just handled the paperwork. They celebrated with mocktails at a restaurant downtown, Rachel sipping sparkling cider while Caro dramatically recounted every moment of the past few months as if they were scenes from a movie. Tommy joined them halfway through, fresh from a meeting with federal prosecutors who had officially named Marcus as a target of their investigation. It's really over, Rachel said, almost to herself. I can't believe it's really over. Well, Tommy said carefully, the legal stuff is over. The emotional stuff might take a while longer. Rachel nodded. She knew he was right. The papers were signed and the custody was settled and the bad guy was facing federal charges. But the trauma didn't just disappear because a judge banged a gavel. She still woke up some nights in a cold sweat, convinced she dreamed the whole thing and was still trapped in her marriage. She still flinched sometimes when her phone rang, expecting it to be Marcus with another gaslighting explanation. But she also knew that healing was possible, that she was already healing, piece by piece, day by day. Thank you, she said to both of them, for everything, for believing me when I wasn't sure I believed myself. Always, Caro said. Any time, Tommy added. 2 weeks later, at 3:47 in the morning, Rachel woke to a sensation she'd been expecting and dreading in equal measure. A tightening in her abdomen, a pressure low in her pelvis, a dampness spreading beneath her that could only mean one thing. She called Caro first, then grabbed the hospital bag she'd packed weeks ago, then waddled to her front door to wait for her ride. The contractions were still far apart, but the anxiety was immediate and overwhelming. What if something went wrong? What if the preeclampsia came back? What if she wasn't strong enough to do this alone? But she wasn't alone, she reminded herself. Caro was on her way. The doctors knew her history. She had a birth plan and a support system, and the knowledge that millions of women had done this before her. She could do it too. The drive to the hospital was surreal. Austin streets empty and gleaming under streetlights. Caro alternating between reassuring words and barely contained excitement. I can't believe I'm going to be Aunt Caro. I've already bought so many onesies, like an unreasonable number of onesies. You didn't have to do that, Rachel managed between contractions. Please, that child is going to be the best-dressed baby in Texas. It's my duty as her godmother. Rachel hadn't asked Caro to be the godmother yet, but hearing the assumption made her smile through the pain. Of course Caro would be the godmother. Who else would it be? At the hospital, things moved quickly. Too quickly, the doctor said, their expressions shifting from calm to concerned as Rachel's blood pressure began to climb. The preeclampsia that had threatened throughout her third trimester was making its final stand. We need to get this baby out, Dr. Martinez said, her voice calm but urgent. Your body is under too much stress. A vaginal delivery is too risky at this point. What does that mean? Rachel gasped, terror clawing at her chest. It means we're doing a cesarean section. Right now, you're going to be fine, Rachel. Your baby is going to be fine. But I need you to trust me. Rachel nodded even as tears streamed down her face. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. She'd had a birth plan, soft music and dim lights and breathing exercises, not emergency surgery and beeping monitors and the barely concealed panic in the nurse's eyes. But then again, nothing about the past year had gone according to plan. Why should this be any different? They wheeled her into the operating room, a cavern of harsh lights and sterile surfaces that seemed designed to maximize terror. Caro couldn't come in. Hospital policy. Rachel was alone with strangers, her lower body going numb from the anesthesia, her heart racing with fear. You're doing great, Dr. Martinez said from somewhere beyond the blue surgical curtain. Just a few more minutes. Rachel stared at the ceiling, trying to focus on breathing, trying not to think about everything that could go wrong. She thought about her mother, who had died without ever meeting her grandchild. She thought about all the struggles of the past year, all the moments when she'd wanted to give up. She thought about the tiny person inside her, fighting to exist, about to enter a world that could be cruel and beautiful, in equal measure. Please be okay, she whispered. Please, please be okay. And then she heard it, a cry, thin and reedy at first, then stronger, angrier, the unmistakable sound of new life announcing its presence to the world. It's a girl, Dr. Martinez said, and Rachel could hear the smile in her voice. A beautiful, healthy girl. They brought her around the curtain a moment later, this tiny, squalling creature wrapped in hospital pink. Rachel's arms reached for her automatically, instinct overriding exhaustion and fear and everything else. Grace Morgan was small, just 6 pounds and 2 ounces, but her cry was mighty. Her face was scrunched in newborn fury, her tiny fists waving at the indignity of being thrust into the cold, bright world. But when Rachel held her against her chest, when Grace heard her mother's heartbeat for the first time from the outside, she settled, her eyes opened, unfocused and wondering, and she looked at Rachel with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone so new. "Hi, baby girl," Rachel whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm your mom. I've been waiting for you for so long." Grace made a small sound, something between a coo and a complaint, and Rachel laughed through her tears. "I know it's been a rough journey for both of us, but we made it. We're here, and I promise you, sweet girl, you will never have to shrink yourself for anyone. You will take up all the space you deserve, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure of that." The next few days in the hospital passed in a haze of feeding schedules and recovery protocols and the overwhelming adjustment to caring for a newborn. Caro came every day, holding Grace with the kind of terrified tenderness that suggested she'd never held a baby before. Tommy sent flowers and a stuffed elephant that was almost as big as Grace herself. Even Brittany Wells, the assistant who had started Rachel's journey of discovery with that anonymous message, sent a card congratulating her on the birth. On Rachel's last day in the hospital, a nurse she didn't recognize came into her room with an envelope. "This was left at the front desk for you," the nurse said, handing it over with a curious expression. "No return address." Rachel opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten in elegant script. "Dear Rachel, you don't know me, but I've been following your story since the video went viral. I'm 34 years old. I've been married for 12 years. I have 2 children. And until last week, I had no idea my husband was living a double life. Your courage in standing up to Marcus Morgan inspired me to start looking more closely at my own marriage. What I found was devastating but necessary. My husband had a second family in another state, 2 children I did not know existed, a mortgage on a house I'd never seen. I'm writing to thank you for showing me that it's possible to fight back, for proving that women like us don't have to accept the roles we've been assigned, for giving me the strength to start my own journey toward freedom. I don't know what the future holds for me, but because of your example, I know I'll face it with my head held high. With gratitude and solidarity, a fellow survivor." Rachel read the letter 3 times, tears blurring her vision by the second reading. She'd known intellectually that her story might resonate with other women, but seeing it in writing, knowing that her struggle had helped even one person find the strength to save herself, made everything she'd been through feel worth it. "What's that?" Caro asked, arriving for her daily visit with a coffee for herself and a decaf for Rachel. Rachel handed her the letter silently. Caro read it, her expression shifting from curiosity to emotion. "Wow," she said when she finished. "Rach, this is incredible." "I know." Rachel looked down at Grace, sleeping peacefully in her hospital bassinet. "I always thought the worst thing that could happen to me was discovering Marcus's betrayal. But now I'm starting to wonder if it was actually the best thing. If I'd never found out, I'd still be trapped in that marriage, still believing his lies, still shrinking myself to fit into the life he wanted. Instead, you're free," Caro said. "You're a mother. You're a survivor. And apparently, you're an inspiration." Rachel smiled, reaching out to touch Grace's tiny hand. "I don't feel like an inspiration. I just feel like someone who did what she had to do." "That's what inspiration is," Caro said gently. "Ordinary people doing extraordinary things because the alternative was unacceptable." Rachel considered that as she prepared to leave the hospital, bundling Grace into the car seat she'd practiced installing a dozen times, checking and rechecking that every strap was secure. She didn't feel extraordinary. She felt tired and overwhelmed and utterly unprepared for the responsibility of keeping another human being alive. But she also felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Real, genuine, sustainable hope for the future. She was going home. Not to the house she'd shared with Marcus, with its expensive furniture and hollow silences. She was going to the small apartment she'd found on her own, with its second-hand couch and sunny windows and complete absence of lies. She was going to start over. And this time, she was going to build a life that was truly hers. 6 months had transformed Rachel Morgan in ways she was only beginning to understand. She stood in the doorway of her apartment on a bright Saturday morning, watching Grace practice sitting up on the colorful playmat that dominated the living room floor. Sunlight streamed through windows she'd hung with yellow curtains, casting warm patches across the hardwood floors. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the particular sweetness of baby shampoo, creating an aroma that had become the signature scent of her new life. The apartment was small by any objective measure. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that required creative organization to accommodate both adult meals and baby food preparation. The furniture was a mismatched collection of pieces she'd bought at estate sales and thrift stores, each one chosen not for how it would look in a magazine spread, but for how it would feel to live with every day. Rachel loved every inch of it. Grace babbled contentedly on her mat, reaching for a stuffed elephant with the determined focus she brought to every new challenge. She'd started crawling last week, a development that had necessitated an urgent baby-proofing session and the installation of gates at every doorway. She was curious and fearless, and utterly convinced that everything in the world existed for her to explore. Just like her mama, Carol liked to say. Once upon a time, anyway. Rachel's phone buzzed with a text from Marcus, picking up Grace at 2 for our Saturday visit. "I'll have her back by 5 as agreed, thank you." She typed back a simple response. "See you then." Their communication had evolved over the past 6 months into something almost cordial. Marcus was out on bail awaiting trial, his assets frozen pending the outcome of the federal investigation. He lived in a small rental apartment now, a far cry from the house they'd shared. His mother had cut off all contact after the scandal, too consumed with salvaging her own social standing to support the son who had dragged her reputation down with him. The supervised visits had become a regular part of their routine. Every Saturday from 2 to 5, Marcus spent time with Grace at a family visitation center, with a court-appointed monitor present to ensure everything remained appropriate. It wasn't ideal, but it was what the court had ordered, and Rachel had learned to accept that Grace deserved to know her father, even a flawed and broken one. At exactly 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Marcus had become punctual to the point of obsession over the past 6 months, as if proving his reliability in small ways might somehow balance the massive ways he'd failed before. Rachel opened the door to find him standing on her welcome mat, looking nothing like the confident executive she'd married. He'd lost weight, and not in a healthy way. His designer suits had been replaced by off-the-rack khakis and a polo shirt that seemed a size too large. His hair, once meticulously styled, was now simply combed to the side with no apparent attention to appearance. But his eyes, when they landed on Grace, still lit up with genuine emotion. "Hi," he said, his voice carrying none of the smoothness she remembered. "How is she today?" "Good, she's been practicing her crawling. I think she'll be walking soon." Rachel stepped aside to let him see Grace on her playmat. "I packed extra diapers and her favorite snacks. The teething has been bothering her, so there's some frozen fruit in the bag too." Marcus nodded, absorbing every detail about his daughter the way he used to absorb information about potential investments. "Thank you, Rachel, for all of this, for not making this harder than it has to be." It was a phrase he'd used before, and Rachel had developed a standard response. "She deserves to know her father. That doesn't mean I've forgiven you." Marcus flinched slightly, but didn't argue. 6 months ago, he would have tried to explain, to justify, to somehow spin his betrayal into something less damning. Now he simply accepted her words and moved on. "I understand," he said. "I'll have her back by 5. Rachel watched from her window as Marcus carefully buckled Grace into the car seat in his rental sedan, checking and rechecking every strap with the meticulous attention of a father who knew his time with his daughter was limited. The court-appointed monitor, a pleasant woman named Susan, sat in the passenger seat with her clipboard and her professional neutrality. When the car pulled away, Rachel felt the familiar pang of anxiety that accompanied every visitation handoff. It was getting easier with time, but it never fully disappeared. Some part of her would always worry about Grace being out of her sight, especially with the man who had tried to take her away entirely. But she'd learned to manage that anxiety rather than letting it manage her. Therapy had helped. So had the support group she'd joined for survivors of narcissistic abuse. So had the simple passage of time, which had gradually proven that Marcus wasn't a physical threat to their daughter, just a deeply flawed person who was finally facing consequences for his choices. Rachel used the 3 hours of child-free time to catch up on work. Real work, the kind she'd never imagined doing a year ago. She'd started volunteering at the Austin Women's Resource Center 4 months earlier, initially just helping with administrative tasks while Grace napped in the on-site childcare room. But it had quickly become clear that her experience, her survival, her ability to articulate what gaslighting and financial abuse looked like from the inside made her uniquely valuable for a different kind of work. Now she spent 15 hours a week training volunteers and counseling women who were just beginning to recognize the patterns in their own relationships. Women who showed up at the center with the same confused, doubting expression Rachel remembered seeing in her own mirror. Women who needed someone to tell them that what they were experiencing was real, that their instincts were valid, that they weren't crazy. The work was emotionally exhausting and incredibly fulfilling in equal measure. Today's task was preparing for Monday's training session, a workshop on recognizing financial abuse that Rachel had developed herself. She'd based it on her own experience, walking through the specific tactics Marcus had used to drain her inheritance while making her feel grateful for his management of their finances. She was deep in her preparation notes when her phone rang. Caro's face filled the screen. "Please tell me you're not working on your day off," Caro said without preamble. "I'm just reviewing some materials for Monday." "Rachel Marie Morgan, you have exactly 3 hours without your child, and you're spending them working? This is an intervention." Rachel laughed despite herself. "It's not really work. It's more like a calling. A calling that can wait until Monday. Put down the laptop and come meet me for coffee. I have news." 20 minutes later, Rachel was sitting across from Caro at their favorite coffee shop, the one with the excellent pastries and the even better people watching opportunities. Caro was practically vibrating with excitement, which could mean anything from a good settlement on one of her cases to finding the perfect pair of shoes on sale. "Okay, spill," Rachel said, wrapping her hands around her latte. "What's the news?" "The federal prosecutor called me this morning." Caro's smile stretched across her entire face. "They finalized the charges against Marcus. 18 counts of wire fraud, 12 counts of embezzlement, 6 counts of money laundering. If convicted on all charges, he's looking at 22 to 27 years. Rachel sat very still, processing the information. 22 to 27 years. Grace would be nearly 30 by the time her father might be released from prison, assuming he served his full sentence. She'd grow up visiting him in a federal facility, if she visited at all. "How do you feel?" Caro asked, watching her carefully. "I don't know," Rachel admitted. "Part of me feels vindicated, like finally he's facing real consequences for what he did. But another part of me just feels sad. Not for him, but for Grace. She's never going to have a normal father-daughter relationship." "She was never going to have that anyway," Caro said gently. "Marcus isn't capable of a normal relationship with anyone. At least this way, she'll grow up knowing the truth about who he is, rather than spending years being manipulated by him like you were." Rachel nodded slowly. "You're right. I know you're right. It's just hard to accept that this is how our story ends." "It's not how your story ends," Caro corrected. "It's how his story ends. Your story is just beginning." They talked for another hour about the case and about Grace's latest developmental milestones and about the man Caro had been cautiously dating for the past few months. Normal friend conversation, the kind Rachel had missed desperately during the years when Marcus had slowly isolated her from everyone who cared about her. By the time she returned to her apartment, Grace was back from her visit, and Susan the monitor was giving Rachel a brief report on how everything had gone. "He's trying," Susan said, her voice carefully neutral. "He read to her for almost an hour, sang some songs, changed a diaper without any help." She paused. "I think he genuinely loves her, in whatever way he's capable of." Rachel accepted this assessment without comment. Marcus's capacity for love was no longer her concern. Her only obligation was to ensure that Grace was safe during their visits, and Susan's reports consistently confirmed that she was. That evening, after Grace was fed and bathed and settled into her crib, Rachel sat on her small balcony with a cup of tea and watched the sunset over Austin's skyline. The city was beautiful from this angle, all golden light and long shadows, the kind of scene that made everything feel possible. Her phone buzzed with a text from Tommy Crawford. "Dinner tomorrow? There's a new Thai place I want to try, completely casual, no pressure, just two friends eating spring rolls." Rachel smiled at the message. Tommy had been carefully, respectfully present throughout the past 6 months. He'd never pushed for anything more than friendship, never made her feel pressured to move faster than she was ready for. But she could see the interest in his eyes, could feel the chemistry that sparked between them during their conversations. She wasn't ready for romance. Not yet. Maybe not for a long time. But she was starting to believe that someday, when the wounds had fully healed and she'd fully reclaimed her sense of self, she might be open to the possibility. Tomorrow works, she texted back, but only if they have mango sticky rice for dessert. Three dots appeared immediately, followed by, I already checked. They do. See you at 7. Rachel set her phone aside and returned her attention to the sunset, feeling something she'd almost forgotten how to feel. Content. Not the desperate, anxious contentment of someone trying to convince herself that her life was fine. Real contentment. The kind that came from knowing exactly who you were and exactly what you wanted and being at peace with both. The next morning brought a surprise. Rachel was feeding Grace her morning oatmeal, both of them wearing more food than they were eating, when the mailman knocked with a package that required a signature. Inside was a box she didn't recognize. No return address, just her name and apartment number written in unfamiliar handwriting. She opened it cautiously, half expecting some kind of unpleasant surprise from one of Marcus's remaining supporters. Instead, she found a letter and a small gift wrapped in tissue paper. Dear Rachel, you don't know me, but I'm the woman who wrote to you in the hospital after Grace was born. The one whose husband had a secret second family. I wanted to update you on what's happened since then. I filed for divorce 3 weeks after I sent that first letter. My husband tried everything to stop me, threats and manipulation and the same kind of gaslighting you described in your story. But every time I wanted to give up, I thought about you, about how you stood in that ballroom, 8 months pregnant, and called out your husband in front of everyone who mattered to him. If you could do that, I told myself, I could certainly file some paperwork. The divorce was finalized last month. I got custody of my children. I got most of the assets since my lawyer was able to prove that my husband had been diverting marital funds to support his secret family for years. And most importantly, I got my life back. I'm writing because I want you to know that your courage had ripple effects you might never have imagined. Because of you, I'm free. Because of me, my children will grow up knowing that their mother fought for them. And someday, they might share that story with someone else who needs to hear it. The gift in the box is for Grace. My daughter picked it out herself when I told her about you. She said every brave girl needs a cape. With eternal gratitude, Margaret Sullivan, P.S. I saw the news about your ex-husband's federal indictment. I hope he gets every single year he deserves. Rachel unwrapped the tissue paper with trembling hands. Inside was a tiny superhero cape, sized for a baby, bright red with gold trim, and a sparkly letter G embroidered on the back. She held it up to show Grace, who immediately grabbed for it with oatmeal-covered fingers. Look, baby girl, Rachel said, her voice thick with emotion. Someone thinks you're a superhero, and you know what? I think they're right. She fastened the cape around Grace's shoulders, and her daughter looked up at her with a gummy smile that made everything, every struggle, every dark night, every moment of doubt, worth it. Later that morning, after Grace was cleaned up and dressed in her cape over a onesie, Rachel did something she'd been putting off for weeks. She opened her laptop and began to write, not a legal brief or a training document or a case study, a personal essay. Her story, in her own words, from the moment she'd received that anonymous message to the moment she'd held her daughter for the first time. She wrote about the gaslighting and the financial abuse and the systematic destruction of her self-esteem. She wrote about the friends who had saved her and the strangers who had helped without ever knowing her name. She wrote about rock bottom and what it felt like to finally stop digging and start climbing. And she wrote about what she'd learned, the hard lessons that no one should have to learn, but that so many women did. Trust your gut. When your instincts scream and your mind makes excuses, listen to the instincts. Document everything. In the age of digital evidence, the truth is harder to hide than ever. Find your people. No one survives this kind of thing alone. And most importantly, you deserve to take up space. The world will try to shrink you, will try to make you smaller and quieter and more convenient. Don't let it. She finished the essay at 2 in the morning after Grace had woken for a feeding and fallen back asleep. It was rough and emotional and probably needed significant editing before it would be ready for anyone else to read. But it existed. Her story and her words, preserved for her daughter and for anyone else who might need to hear it. Rachel saved the document and closed her laptop, feeling lighter than she had in years. 6 weeks later, the essay was published in a national magazine, accompanied by a photo of Rachel and Grace on their sunny balcony. The response was overwhelming. Thousands of comments from women sharing their own stories. Hundreds of emails from survivors thanking her for putting words to experiences they'd struggled to articulate. Invitations to speak at conferences, in women's groups, and university classes studying domestic abuse. Rachel said yes to some of them and no to others, learning slowly to set boundaries, to protect her time and energy, to prioritize her own well-being and Grace's needs over the demands of a world that suddenly wanted a piece of her story. The most meaningful invitation came from the Austin Women's Resource Center, where she'd been volunteering for months. They offered her a permanent position as Director of Survivor Advocacy, a role that would let her shape programs for women escaping abusive relationships while still maintaining flexibility for her responsibilities as a single mother. She accepted immediately. On her first official day in the new role, Rachel arrived at the center to find a small celebration waiting. Streamers and a cake and a card signed by every staff member and volunteer. Kara was there, having taken the morning off work to support her friend. Tommy was there too, having driven up from Houston, where he had relocated after Morgan Tech collapsed. "Speech, speech," Caro called out, and everyone laughed. Rachel stood before the small crowd, her daughter on her hip and her future stretching out before her, and thought about everything that had brought her to this moment. "A year ago," she began, "I thought my life was over. I thought being a good wife meant being small, being quiet, being grateful for whatever scraps my husband chose to give me. I thought that was love, and I would have spent the rest of my life believing that if someone hadn't sent me a message that changed everything." She paused, adjusting Grace, who was trying to eat her necklace. "I'm not going to pretend that the past year has been easy. It's been the hardest thing I've ever done, and I'm standing in a room full of people who made it possible. But I want everyone here to know that I'm grateful. Not for the pain, but for what the pain taught me. That I'm stronger than I knew. That there are good people in the world who will fight for you when you can't fight for yourself. And that it's never, ever too late to start over." She looked around the room at the faces of people who had become her community, her chosen family, her reason for getting up every morning and doing this work. "So thank you for believing in me, for giving me this opportunity, and for reminding me every single day that the best way to heal from trauma is to help others heal from theirs." The applause was warm and genuine, and Rachel let herself bask in it for just a moment before the practical demands of her new job pulled her back into action. That evening, she took Grace for a walk through their neighborhood, the red cape still fastened around her tiny shoulders. They stopped at a playground where other mothers sat on benches, watching their children play, and Rachel felt a sudden surge of belonging. This was her life now, not the Instagram-perfect existence she'd tried to maintain with Marcus, but something messier and realer and infinitely more valuable. Single motherhood and survivor advocacy and slow healing and the gradual rediscovery of who she was meant to be. Grace reached up from her stroller, grabbing for Rachel's face with her small, insistent hands. "What is it, baby girl?" Rachel asked, leaning down. Grace smiled her gummy smile and said something that sounded almost like "Mama." Rachel's heart stopped, then started again with renewed purpose. "That's right," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm your mama, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you know how loved you are, how strong you are, how much space you deserve to take up in this world." Grace babbled happily, seemingly unaware that she'd just spoken her first word. But Rachel would remember this moment forever. This playground, this evening, this tiny human who had given her a reason to fight when she'd been ready to surrender. She thought about Marcus, awaiting trial in his small apartment, his empire in ruins, his reputation destroyed. She thought about Vanessa, still trying to rebuild her influencer brand while the internet never let her forget what she'd done. She thought about Diane, isolated and impoverished, paying the price for her complicity in her son's crimes. She didn't wish them well exactly, but she didn't wish them ill either. They simply didn't matter anymore. They were characters from a story that had ended, and Rachel was too busy writing her new story to spend energy on the old one. The sun was setting as she pushed Grace's stroller back towards their apartment, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. It looked like a promise, Rachel thought, like the universe was telling her that beautiful things could come from terrible circumstances, that endings could become beginnings, that the darkest chapters could lead to the brightest ones. She thought about Margaret Sullivan and all the other women who had reached out since her story went public. She thought about the women she hadn't heard from yet, the ones still trapped in relationships that were slowly destroying them, still believing the lies their partners told them about who they were and what they deserved. She made a silent vow to reach as many of them as she could, to share her story and listen to theirs, to be the voice that told them what she needed to hear. It's not you. It was never you. And it's not too late to take up space. Grace fell asleep before they returned home, her tiny chest rising and falling beneath her superhero cape. Rachel carried her inside, settled her in her crib, and stood for a long moment just watching her breathe. "Sweet dreams, my love," she whispered. "Tomorrow we're going to have another beautiful day together. And the day after that, and the day after that, forever and ever for as long as I live." She turned off the light and walked to her own bedroom, where the window looked out over a city full of strangers, some of them suffering, some of them surviving, some of them just beginning to recognize that their lives could be different. Rachel Morgan had been all three, and now finally she was something else entirely. She was free, she was strong, she was taking up space, and she was just getting started. And that's Rachel's story, a story of betrayal, survival, and the incredible strength that lives inside every woman who refuses to be silenced. Now I have a question for you. What would you have done in Rachel's situation? Would you have confronted Marcus immediately? Or would you have stayed silent and planned your escape like she did? Drop your answer in the comments below. I read every single one, and I genuinely want to know how you would handle this impossible situation. If this story moved you, if it made you angry or hopeful, or reminded you of your own strength, hit that like button. It takes 1 second, but it helps more people find stories like this one. And if you're new here, welcome to the family. We tell stories about women who fight back, women who survive, women who refuse to shrink themselves for anyone. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss the next chapter. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, no matter what you're going through right now, it's never too late to take up space. See you in the next story.